Hi everyone, welcome to the presentation for my Capstone project. In this presentation, I will present my study related to the worldwide suicide rate. First of all, let's quickly go through the agenda for today. I will share some of the background information related to the suicide rate, especially its development in the recent years. Then I would introduce the data structure of the dataset that is used for this study. We will then define the goals that we would like to achieve. Based on the study goals, we'll select the appropriate method and we'll report the results. And finally, we will summarize the main findings and we will discuss the limitations of the project. Let's get started. Suicide has become one of the leading causes of deaths in the recent years, and the suicide rate has increased by almost 60% worldwide in the past 45 years. With the projection from WHO, we would expect further increase in the suicide rate in the future. Suicide not only puts the conductor's life at risk, it may also bring a long-lasting effect on the conductor's family, friends, and even communities. This is why many studies have been conducted to better understand the causes of suicide and the ways to prevent the suicide from happening. In this study, we'll utilize a dataset collected by WHO, which contains the number of suicide completed and the total population by country, by sex group, and by age group, with a time range from year 1979 to 2016. Based on the exploratory analysis, we have removed some of the observations from the dataset. We also grouped the countries into 6 different regions in order to get a better result. Now let's define the goals for this study. First of all, we would like to identify if there's any characteristics of the population that may lead to higher risk of suicide. Secondly, we would like to investigate into the time series of the worldwide suicide rate from many different perspectives, like by regions, by sex, and by age groups. Thirdly, we would like to see if there's any possible time series models that might help us to predict the future suicide rate based on the historical trend. Here are the methods that has been utilized in order to achieve the study goals. First of all, we have used the ANOVA and the Tukey comparison to determine if there's any significant differences in the main effect and in the interaction terms. As shown in the study diagram, there are 3 main effects. They are region, sex, and age group. There are also 4 interaction terms, and the experiment unit for this analysis is countries. We'll then use various time series plots to present the historical trend. We'll also explore possible prediction models for the future trend. Now let's discuss the main findings of this project. First of all, based on the ANOVA result, the p-value for all 3 main effects is less than 0.05. Therefore, we can conclude with 95% of confidence that at least one group and each main effect is statistically significant different from the other groups. In this slide, we can see the Tukey analysis for one of the main effect region. As we can see, the suicide rate for Arabic states is significantly below the suicide rate for all other regions. On the other hand, North America has the highest suicide rate on average. The Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America regions generally have a significantly higher suicide rate than other regions. Next, it's very easy to tell that the average suicide rate for female is significantly below the average suicide rate for male. Finally, for the last main effect, the age group, we can see that the average suicide rate for population between 5 years old and 14 years old is significantly below the average suicide rate for all other age groups, and all other age groups have similar average suicide rate. Based on the ANOVA analysis, there are also 2 significant interaction terms. They are the interaction between sex group and age groups, and the interaction between region and sex groups. Regarding to the interaction between the sex groups and the age groups, we can see that for female, there's a decreasing trend in the suicide rate as the population gets older. However, on the other hand, for the males, there's an increasing trend in the suicide rate as the population gets older. In terms of the interaction between region and sex groups, we can see that for Asia, Pacific, Europe, and South America region, this differences in the suicide rate between female and male is very significant. This difference is less significant for North America and for Africa regions. And for Arabic states, we cannot really tell if there's any difference in the suicide rate for male and for female. Now let's see the time series plot by region. For most of the regions, we can see that there's a downward trend in the most recent years. Especially for Europe, we can see that there's a significant decrease from year 2000 until 2015. However, the suicide rate for North America region and South America region tends to increase in the recent years. By further investigating the time series plot for North America region, we notice that the suicide rate for Canada remains relatively consistent in the recent years. However, the suicide rate for United States has increased significantly from 2000 to 2015, which explains the majority of the increase in the North America regions. Now let's take a look at the time series plot by sex. As expected, the suicide rate for male is higher than the suicide rate for female for the entire time from 1979 to 2015. In recent years, the overall suicide rate for male has dropped rapidly. There is also a downward trend in the suicide rate for female. However, this drop is just not as significant as the one for male. With the time series plot by age group, we can see that most of the age groups follow a similar trend in the past and show a downward trend in the recent years. And generally speaking, the older the age group, the higher the suicide risk is. Now let's get to the last part of this research. In the time series plot for the overall suicide rate, we can see that in the early stage, the suicide rate is very non-stable and doesn't really share a similar behavior as the suicide rate in the recent years. Therefore, we decide to only include the information between 1995 through 2015 in our time series analysis. After we take the first difference, the series is more stationary without any specific trend, and there's no obvious outliers in the series, and the variance stays relatively consistent throughout the time. However, there isn't any significant lag or patterns in the ACF and PACF plot, and the series seems to be purely white noise. Several different models has been explored, and one of the ARIMA model has been selected as it has the lowest BIC statistic. Based on this model, the suicide rate tends to decrease every year. However, further investigation and validation of this time series model are needed. In conclusion, some of the major findings are summarized here. Certain regions such as Asia, Pacific, Europe, and North America tends to have a higher risk of suicide than other regions. Male generally have a higher suicide risk than female, and there's a downward trend in the recent years for most of the regions other than United States. And we didn't find any significant autocorrelation in the suicide rate between different years. Finally, the limitations of this research will be discussed here. Due to the nature of the problem, this research is based on observations instead of experiment. Due to the limitation of the data, this study only focuses on the number of suicide completed. However, the number of suicide attempts might be a better indicator for mental health of the population. Also, due to the limitation of the data, certain countries are not considered in this research, such as China and India. And the grouping of countries and districts is based on their geographical locations. There might be other factors that potentially have influences over the suicide rate, such as economic development level and religions. Here are the citations for this research, and thank you for your attention.